Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry for the delay. There was some last minute urgency. Now, in terms of what we were discussing, you've got, I think, AUKUS quad and the AUKUS quad handout you've got, right? There's one more handout on the Lookie's policy in general. वो मैं आपको you'll get it tomorrow. Though from tomorrow onwards you'll have the other subjects. The January batch people may have other classes, and the other people may have other classes. So, but that the Lookie's policy वाला एक और separate 9-10 page का document है. That I'll give tomorrow. Now, if you look at Quad, AUKUS and RCEP, so we've largely discussed about RCEP already, right? The issues also in RCEP is functioning, whether it was with respect to the possibility of further deepening the inequality in the trade relationship with China, or also the fact of concerns of Indian automobile manufacturers or the pharmaceutical companies, or also the fact that it did not cover services sector as such, something that was one of the priority areas for India. And because of this, the way forward as of now for India has been to utilize the existing FTAs that India has with almost every other ASEAN member country and even countries like Japan, etc. And also to use other measures such as the supply chain resilience initiative and all those things, right? Helping countries like Japan, etc. to diversify their manufacturing bases away from China, but still have a China plus one strategy. Please understand one thing when I was saying yesterday China plus one, and ये मैं आपको अभी भी बता रहा हूँ. China plus one strategy says that almost any big manufacturer, whether it's from Japan or the United States, which has a manufacturing base in China, must look at slowly diversifying away from China. Any diversification of manufacturing base will never happen overnight. ऐसा नहीं होगा कि कल Apple was manufacturing in China and tomorrow one fine day it has shut shop in China and moved completely elsewhere. So the idea is that they will continue to depend on China, but at least decrease the dependence on China and thus have China plus one under their diversification idea. And if you see, for example, South Korea and India's attempt is also partly this, that as these players look to diversify away from China, I'll give you a separate handout on SCRI also. Okay. As they look to diversify away from China, India must emerge as one of the preferred destinations to attract investments from Japanese companies, Korean companies, etc. to India, right? And you see already that it's not just SCRI, but SCRI has given a further boost to this idea. That if you look, for example, in automobile companies like Samsung, like Hyundai, a Korean company, much before pre-independence only had established its manufacturing base in Tamil Nadu. But pre-independence, I mean pre-2014. Had established its manufacturing base in Tamil Nadu. And Hyundai, Coimbatore, etc. emerged as major manufacturing destinations for automobile sector in India. The second is also, if you look recently under the current tenure, there has been the government's strong focus on in the mobile section. If you look in the mobile segment, India was importing large number of these mobile phones from whom? China. Now, towards assembly of these mobile phone components, units have been set up in Noida. For example, a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, there was this movement of, there was announcements made by Samsung, again a Korean company, of shifting, of, establishing its assembly base. Please understand, mobile के अंदर दो ही important चीज है. सबसे important चीज है semiconductor, rare earth, semiconductor, and then assembly. Now, please understand, right now we don't have any major manufacturing bases in semiconductors nor in rare earths. But at least on the assembly line side, there is a positive movement. So at least that is something which is of significance, which has happened in the past couple of years. Some of the areas where manufacturing has actually improved in India in the past 7 years has been in the electronic segment. there definitely the progress has been registered, some further in automobile, but that's there. So the idea has been partly to do this kind of a diversification and attract investment under the Make in India strategy as well, further deepening India's economic cooperation with many of the East Asian economies. So this is that broad context जो हम बात करी थी कल mostly. Now further, let's now talk about Quad, AUKUS and their implications for India, because that's what we are concerned about. I'll also give you, just for understanding sake, one PowerPoint presentation on Quad. I'll not give you the printout of it. वो आप पढ़ लीजिएगा. If required, I'll have to search for that. एक मैंने बहुत मेहनत से बनाई थी एक बार, 1-2 साल पहले. So if I'm able to find one or two of those presentations, अपने कंप्यूटर में ढूंढ के I'll send it across to you. So you can go through that, which is primarily for understanding. जो बिल्कुल एग्जाम ओरिएंटेड है वो मैं आपको either dictating or I'll give you printouts or something. But those are one or two presentations from understanding point of view. So that you can go through. Now let's talk about Quad and AUKUS. Yeah. So let me just. So if we talk about Quad and AUKUS, the idea of Quad, if you remember, I told you that partly first came the idea of RCEP in the past 7 to 8 to 9 years. One of the ideas that RCEP was given first, and then you see Quad and AUKUS also coming into the picture. But technically speaking, the idea of Quad is a much older idea. If you go into the history of it, which is just I'm telling you broadly from the understanding point of view. Question अगर आएगा तो आपको एकदम simple आएगा, Quad and its implications for Indian foreign policy, or AUKUS and its implication for Indian foreign policy. But just one second. So yes. So Quad and its implications when we talk about for Indian foreign policy. If you look at some of the earliest ideas of Quad or the idea of Quad being formally stated, it was first stated in 2007. Just समझने के लिए समझ लीजिए. Okay, it was first stated formally in 2007 by the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. So Shinzo Abe first formulated or proposed this idea of a grouping, of a 4-member grouping called as the Quad in 2007. And the idea was to involve US, India, Australia and Japan in terms of maintaining a free and open oceanic trade routes along the Indian Ocean and the Pacific region. In the Indian Ocean and the Pacific region. And if you look at this, if this was the case in 2007, why was this idea actually talked about in 2007? Obviously, one of the primary concerns of Japan. देखिए थोड़ा सा अगर मैं आपको context मैंने, I think yes, I remember I told you this when I was talking to you about the map of South China and East China also, that if you look into the history of World War II and the period around it, Japan had colonized whom? China, and had colonized much larger areas in the Indo-Pacific region or in the Pacific Ocean region as well. Now, so there is that colonial history and rivalry between Japan and China also, and then the territorial tensions in the East China Sea as well, right? Now, in this context, by 2007, it was clear to many in Japan that a rising China is going to be first and foremost a concern for countries like Japan, with whom they've had a historical rivalry. And to that extent, Japan was one of the foremost voices in terms of, expressing its concerns. Please also bear in mind, Japan, does it have nuclear weapons? No. Japan doesn't have nuclear weapons. In fact, it has a very strong, as of now, a tradition against the use or possession or use of nuclear weapons, given that it is the only country which has suffered a nuclear attack. Also bear in mind that while Japan doesn't have nuclear weapons, China has. On top of that, so while Japan doesn't have nuclear weapons and China has, countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, they don't have nuclear weapons. None of these players have nuclear weapons. And if you were to ask yourself this question, if they don't have nuclear weapons, how do they sleep peacefully at night with having a China in its backyard, which is militarily and economically also powerful and is a nuclear weapon state? Because technically they come because of US alliance commitments under a US nuclear umbrella. But a question which has always been asked about US nuclear policy is that while on paper, US has obviously said that when it comes to a Japan or a South Korea or Australia, which come under a formal treaty under its nuclear umbrella, that if China attacks any of these countries with a nuclear weapon, then US will respond as if it is an attack on US soil or US territory. But a question which has always been asked is, will Washington be as concerned if a Canberra or a Seoul or Tokyo is attacked by Chinese weapons, nuclear weapons? When push comes to shove, when it comes to the actual conflict, will US stand by its word or not? पहला तो एक ही कंसर्न, ठीक है. पार्टली तो देखिए, आप जो लिखा है और साइन किया है वो कोई जरूरी नहीं है दैट ऑन द बैटलफील्ड पार्टनर्स स्टिक. इफ यू गो टू वर्ल्ड वॉर वन, व्हेन आई विल टेल यू इन वर्ल्ड हिस्ट्री, you go to World War I. In World War I, Italy was earlier on the side of Britain and France. But when the war began, immediately switched sides. Okay. So it's not that allies will always stand by you or will be willing to risk a larger nuclear confrontation with China to protect its smaller ally in the region. It may be there that in such a nuclear standoff, US may back off, even if China resorts to a use of nuclear weapons against one of US allies in the region. So there is that one concern. Partly only, but that concern is at least paid to some rest because of the fact that China has a no first use policy with respect to nuclear weapons. But does US have a no first use policy with respect to nuclear weapons? No. But US has probably the only country which has used nuclear weapons. That is also always there, that even though a country has a no first use policy, it is at least in the realm of possibility that in an actual conflict, it may not wait for being attacked first. But I'm not getting the nuclear question right now. It is an extremely complex question. But what I'm trying to say is that if you understand the sensitivities or the concerns of Japan were with a rising China, which was a fast-growing economy with a fast increasing naval presence and also a nuclear power. So Japan was one of the foremost countries, and Shinzo Abe was one of the foremost ones who wanted to lead an attempt to form a coalition of the willing, if you were to call so, coalition of countries who had like-minded concerns with respect to China's rise or assertiveness. Okay, this is that broad context. And you see that with these concerns, Shinzo Abe had proposed this idea. However, no other player was willing to actually support openly the formulation of such an organization. So in 2007, while Japan took the lead, in proposing the formulation while Japan took the lead in proposing what? The formulation of a Quad-like grouping. Driven by the concerns around a rapidly growing Chinese economy coupled with increasing Chinese naval expenditure, rapidly growing Chinese economy coupled with an increasing Chinese naval expenditure, and assertiveness in the South and East China Sea, other potential partners did not display the same level of enthusiasm, or did not display similar eagerness to formalize the grouping. Why? Because of many reasons. If I was to tell you, US में क्या हुआ 2008? Financial crisis, right? The 2008 financial crisis, and with the economy facing a rude shock, the focus was more on reforming or dealing with your internal economic, dealing with the US internal economic challenges, rather than getting into a larger engagement aimed at containing China or anything. Mind you, right now they're also involved in Afghan war, and right now they're not even planned phasing out their withdrawal from Afghanistan. They're right now at the peak of the engagement in Afghanistan, deploying more troops and more funds in the war with Afghanistan. So whether it's their engagement in Afghanistan, whether it's their financial crisis, ये कोई पूछेगा नहीं आपसे, बट मैं समझा रहा हूं. क्योंकि ये मैं क्यों समझा रहा हूं? Because between 2007 to 2017, many of these deterrents disappeared, and there was a realization amongst parties that the China challenge is real and growing at a fast pace. Okay, so whether it's the financial crisis, whether it's the Afghan war, or also whether there was a proposal of G2. There was a proposal of G2 given here. They basically, Obama, by the end of Bush regime and the beginning of the Obama era, Obama became first time president 2008 to 12, then 12 to 16. Okay, So during the first phase of Obama tenure, Obama gave this idea that, see, historically, if you see, again, ये सब कुछ historical context में अगर अपन समझेंगे, things will become much easier. Whenever there has been one great power and there has been a potential rival power, often their rivalry has resulted in wars. Wars which have engulfed either them directly or other countries directly or indirectly. If you look, just to give you that sense of history, 1700s and 1800s, the major European rivalry was between Britain and France. World War I to World War II, the major rivalry was between Britain and Germany, partly also a very strong role of France. But primarily between Britain and Germany, because the contest was between them of who will dominate Europe. And the one who will dominate Europe will dominate the world. And at this time also, by World War II, of two successive wars, Germany obviously was defeated in both World War I and II, but Britain also became extremely, or bit, if not extremely, but financially weak because of the expenditures and the destructions caused by World War I and II. And so emerged a transition between Britain and USA. One of the few peaceful transitions between global powers, where one global power gave way to the other without engaging in an open conflict with each other. And that happened because of a variety of reasons. Uske kai reasons hai, I'm not going to go into that, but a largely peaceful transition. But then emerged a rivalry between, and this led to Cold War. In this Cold War, USA and Soviet Union, did they fight each other? Yes, they fought each other, but what proxy or whatever, what they fought in third countries. Let's put it this way. Because proxy war today is a very commonly used, misused, or should I say abused term. So everybody in your country today who is, देखिए US में एक बड़ा simple term था, McCarthyism during the Cold War. Anybody who was critical of the US capitalist system during the 1950s was said to be a Soviet agent. Anybody in Soviet Union who was contesting the planning ideas of the socialist methodology or socialist planning was said to be a US agent, saying कि they are fighting what? Proxy war. तो ये proxy war जो है, किसी ने बताया, दोवल साहब ने बताया कि आजकल जो हो रहा है वॉरफेयर हो रहा है सिविल सोसाइटी की डोमेन में, और ये कोई बहुत बड़ी नई चीज है, इसमें कुछ भी नया नहीं है. ड्यूरिंग द कोल्ड वॉर ऑल्सो यूएस एंड सोवियत यूनियन fought a war of propaganda as well, where US movies depicted that the Soviets were good for nothing, that the Russians were these kind of people who were inhuman and were willing to crush their opponents, etc. And the same happened with the Soviet propaganda. Okay, so there is always, while there is a war in the international, or if there is a rivalry or there is a war in the international sphere going on, there is also a rivalry and war going on for capturing minds, not just for capturing territories. Okay, so वो एक अलग कहानी है. But let's not go there. Simple point is, US and Soviet Union fought during the Cold War in third countries like a Vietnam, like a Korea and elsewhere, where both were trying to establish either a government which was tilting towards USA or tilting towards Soviet Union. So the Cold War was not cold, it was hot. But rather than these countries directly engaging in open conflict with each other, they were fighting in third countries trying to put in favorable regimes. If you look, however, today, and then with the Cold War ending, what happened? USA emerged as the sole power. We had, after a long period, a unipolar world. But it is often said that such a unipolar world has been often an exception rather than norm in global history. मतलब ज़्यादातर it has been either a bipolar or even a multipolar world. Okay, but unipolar, where there's only one major power in the world, is a very rare phenomena. And in the context of even post-Cold War era, while it initially seemed that it will be a unipolar world, and it was unipolar for 15-20 years between 1990 to 2007, it was as clear as daylight by 2007 itself that China may emerge as a possible challenge to whom? US. As a major possible challenge. By the way, another country which was in the race in 2007 after China was whom? India. Most people, obviously, we have very short memories, right? I mean, people have forgotten many things. But in 2007, if you open up the statistics of 2007, India was still close to whom? The Chinese. Close का मतलब वो तब भी हमसे double GDP पे थे. More than twice the GDP वो तब भी थे. But India was growing fast. Okay, India was growing fast. In fact, one of the highest periods of India's economic growth has been between 2008 to 2002 to 2008, or more so up till 2009 also, which involved a certain period of the NDA era also, and then the UPA era also, UPA 1 predominantly. Okay, this was India's period of rapid economic growth. The world was also growing fast, and so was India. After China, India had the fastest growing economic rate. Please understand, always जो आपने basic economics में पढ़ा होगा, ये बकवास about economic growth rates can never be, you should never look at growth rates without looking at the base. Sir, you have 50 marks out of 100. Next exam, out of 100, you had 75. Growth? Almost a 50% growth rate. You had already 90. And now you scored 95. What growth rate? Growth rate of economies, like, sorry, आप कैसा बकवास example दे रहे हैं maths का, economy का. If you are a $7 trillion economy, say hypothetically, and you have a growth rate of, say, 10%, how much are you adding? Something around 700 billion. अगर आपका 10% growth rate है to your economy. If you have an economy which is 3 trillion and you have a growth rate of 12%, say hypothetically, then how much are you adding? 360 billion. है ना? यही हुआ गणित. Please understand, as the size of the base grows, the growth rate automatically starts dropping, right? So, but still, India was playing catch up, and it seemed that if India kept growing and China kept slowing, India will overtake China. Okay, and India's location, geography, India's naval prowess, all of them made India a potential partner for the future. That 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, India will probably equal China or may even overcome China, who knows. Also, the idea that India is a democracy, a multi-party democracy, has certain degree of democratic coherence also with Japan or a US or Australia. All of this was also in the picture. And that India could play a role of balancing out whom? China in the future. Things have changed since then. The gap between India and China, which seemed to be narrowing up till 2008, has gone wider. China is slowing down, definitely. However, India is not growing as fast as it would have wanted to. ये सब facts है ना? क्यों में तो हम जाते ही नहीं है, तो but ऐसा है. So because of these concerns, you see why the world and even ASEAN countries look towards whom? India. There was no other player in the region. Japan, for example, was still a larger economy than India, but it was already in a stagnation mode. Japan's population is already aging. Its population is contracting. India was something that ASEAN countries looked towards. And Japan also looked towards. Okay. So, जो मैंने आपको बोला, ये इसको इकोनॉमी में हमेशा क्या कहते हैं? बेस इफेक्ट, है ना, कि बेस इफेक्ट देख के ही ग्रोथ रेट की बात करिए. एंड आई विल टेल यू, I have seen many distinguished economists in newspaper articles through discussions openly talking about growth rates without talking about the base, which makes it very clear as daylight that it's not that they don't understand it. They obviously know it. अगर मुझे पता है तो उन्हें तो पता ही है, but they don't want to bring that nuance into the discussion. So if you look at this, that during this period, why did proposal of G2 was something where I will come back to this, what I wanted to explain, that USA proposed that if the 21st century has to be a peaceful century, then USA and China have to coexist and they must jointly develop rules for the world. Obama proposed that we can jointly coexist. Let's have a peaceful world order. And for this, US and China must probably coexist and set rules together. But none of this worked. Okay. India also, China strongly, by the way, expressed reservations against Japan for expressing this idea of Quad. India also backed off. Why? Because at this time, India also kept arguing what US was saying, that we can have a peaceful Asian century. India and China have enough space to coexist and grow together. India and China are not each other's rivals. Okay. So there was also this assertion in India that India and China can peacefully coexist together. Mind you, since 1992, we had a peace and tranquility agreement, trade was growing, there was no standoffs major between 92 and 2008-7, and it seemed that peace will prevail and relations can grow. So the possibility of India-China coexistence and the peaceful rise of both was expressed routinely. Australia also, please understand, Australia has a certain economic dependence on whom? China. Because Australia's economy, for example, is largely based on exporting minerals like coal, like iron, etc. to whom? China. Like their agricultural products or even wines. So whether it is their fisheries, whether it is wines, whether it is minerals like iron, etc., Australia heavily exported to whom? China, which China would obviously use for its manufacturing base. Australia also backed off the moment China strongly expressed its concerns. So almost all parties backed off. But 10 years later, in 2017, things changed. So what things changed? As you know by now, so Australia, given Australia's economic dependence on whom? On the Chinese market for its exports of minerals or wines or fisheries. You see, Australia also backed off at this time. Now, since 2008 to 2017, many a number of things have changed. What has changed? Clearly, China's assertiveness in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. South China Sea, SCS, or East China Sea. Also, China's proposal of Belt and Road Initiative since 2011 onwards, and its effort at resorting to debt trap diplomacy. The next is that, so that's one thing which has happened. The Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. The proposal of the Belt and Road Initiative. Assertiveness where they made under their claims under what was called as the 9-dash line formula. मैंने बताया था 9-dash line formula, the tongue-shaped 9-dash line claims that they made in the South China Sea. Secondly, the rising US, China tensions, which were, for example, over their rising trade disputes, which started from 2013-14 onwards, including on IPR or intellectual property rights violations, corporate espionage. The Chinese companies have been accused by US companies of trying to steal intellectual property. Okay. So, corporate espionage, etc. Obviously, the rising US-China tensions over Taiwan, right? Please understand that USA has supported the democratic players in Taiwan for a while, even while they have recognized Taiwan as a part of China. They have supported the democratic establishment in Taiwan repeatedly, and even the US military establishment has a base in Taiwan. Okay, so that is there. So the rising US-China tensions, whether it is in Taiwan or even in Philippines, is something which was happening. Needless to say, also, when it comes to whom, this is about US. The next is whom? India, if you were to talk about. I told you, between here, 2008 to 2017, India and China had frequent border standoffs. And if there was the Chumar and the Daulatabad incident in 2013-14, so if this was the case here, the Doklam incident is where things became very clear, because it was a very long standoff. So the Doklam incident brought with itself, or the prolonged standoff for almost more than 2 months, it brought a certain realization in New Delhi that there is a need of considering working with like-minded partners as far as dealing with China. Brought an attitude shift where? In New Delhi. Please also understand Australia. Australia, by 2017, there was evidence that China was trying to interfere in the domestic politics of Australia by funding the political campaigns of certain parties. And देखिए, मैंने आपको ऑस्ट्रेलिया का एग्जाम्पल दे दिया, एंड दिस इज ऑन रिकॉर्ड. ऑस्ट्रेलिया एंड श्रीलंका. पाकिस्तान तो आप भगवान जाने, but Australia and Sri Lanka, there is a clear, credible, undeniable evidence that the Chinese have funded certain political parties. In fact, after 2008, I mean, it's peculiar that Australia actually, in their domestic law, lifted restrictions allowing political parties to raise money from international sources. And the Chinese poured in money. And there was evidence that they were supporting certain political parties very strongly. 2017, they brought in a law to revoke. ये सब लिखने की जरूरत नहीं है, सिर्फ कॉन्टेक्स्ट है, समझ लीजिए. They brought in a law to revoke this funding, international funding for, because by law they had allowed companies, other non-Australian companies also to fund whom? Chinese political parties. And in 2017, because of these incidences, they revoked that permission and showed the need to regain or ensure that China does not overtly interfere in the internal affairs of Australia. Okay. अब इसके अंदर की मैं डिटेल्स में नहीं जाना चाहता, हम ऑस्ट्रेलिया के एक्सपर्ट थोड़ी ना बनना है. There was the Kevin Rudd was there, and there were others, and they had this thing. So, long story cut short, this is what is happening in Australia. Leads to a curious question. In India, are political parties allowed to raise money from foreign donors or foreign enterprises or non-Indian companies? Yes, no? Indian companies obviously can fund Indian political parties, but can foreign companies fund Indian political parties? Suppose, say, a Coca-Cola. Can it fund an Indian political party? Yes and no both. Yes and no both. We are India. We are different. देखिए, कहानी बहुत अच्छी है, कभी इलेक्टोरल रिफॉर्म्स में पढ़ ही लीजिएगा. पहले मैं पढ़ाता था, फिर मैंने पढ़ाना ही छोड़ दिया इलेक्टोरल रिफॉर्म्स. मतलब क्या रिफॉर्म करना है इसमें, ऑसम चल रहा है सब, राइट. तो देखिए, अकॉर्डिंग टू इंडियाज FCRA रूल्स, द फॉरेन कंट्रीब्यूशन रेगुलेशन एक्ट of 1976, you can't take any money from foreign companies. No funding can come to Indian political parties from foreign companies, nor to Indian media houses or a certain number of other entities. This act was amended in 2010. Under whom? UPA. But even after that FCRA amendment of 2010, foreign companies were not allowed to donate money to Indian political parties. Then there was a case in the Delhi High Court which was lodged in 2013 because RTI revealed that Vedanta Mining Corporation had made donations through its Indian office to both the BJP and Congress. And according to FCRA, any political party taking money from a foreign company would be disqualified to contest election. On the eve of the 2014 election, two major political parties of India, technically speaking, would be disqualified from contesting elections if you were to go by the FCRA. तो दिल्ली हाईकोर्ट ने अभी रुको, सुनते हैं तुमको. इलेक्शन कैसे होगा, आपको क्या लग रहा है? तो this all matter went on. In the meanwhile, the elections happened. The Delhi High Court gave the verdict that these political parties had violated the FCRA provisions, making it possible for the Election Commission to disqualify these parties from contesting elections. By the way, by 2014, obviously we gained independence and a new party came to power. They went ahead and retrospectively amended the 2010 FCRA Act, and they changed the definition of foreign companies. In India, still political parties are not allowed to raise money from foreign companies, but they changed the definition of what you call as a foreign company. इसका सिंपल सा एक ये है कि अभी ये फॉरेन कंपनी क्या होती है? That, for example, there is a foreign company, we say any company whose majority ownership is with non-Indian stakeholders. ठीक है, like Coca-Cola. Not majority ownership is not with Indian stakeholders. So technically it would be a foreign company. However, they amended the definition of foreign company saying that if Coca-Cola was to open an Indian office and through this Indian office give money to Indian political parties, then because the money is coming from their Indian office, it is an Indian company. Through their Indian subsidiary, if you are giving money to Indian political parties, it is a Indian company. Why did they so? Because Vedanta had donated money through an Indian subsidiary. So they changed the definition itself. Now, once the definition was retrospectively amended, it obviously is no longer a crime. Obviously, the Delhi High Court's verdict will not apply. And after that, in 2017, the great Indian finance minister, independent India's first finance minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, introduced a legendary electoral bonds provision under which no longer any such information is available anyways under any RTI, anything. And now and anyways, ho bhi jayegi to now they are all Indian companies. There cannot be any illegality. The law itself is changed. ये एक अलग लेवल का गेम है, इसका कोई जवाब नहीं है. So technically, yes, are foreign companies allowed to donate money to Indian political parties? No. The answer is no. If in the prelims exam the option comes, are foreign companies allowed to donate money to Indian political parties under FCRA? The answer is no. But the reality is this. Who cares about reality? So, जी तो हाँ no, they are not. Government is saying these are not foreign companies. They are Indian companies. Indian. The definition of a foreign company under the SEBI Act is different. Different laws के अंदर foreign company की definition भी अलग है. तो जो अब इंडिया में काम कर रहे हैं वो इंडियन नहीं हुई. एम्प्लॉय, मैं आपको यही बता रहा हूं ना, ये सब टेक्निकलिटी. फॉर एग्जांपल अंडर द इनकम टैक्स एक्ट देयर इज समथिंग दैट्स कॉल्ड अ पीई, अ परमानेंट एस्टैब्लिशमेंट. फॉर एग्जांपल, जब ये सब बहुत थोड़ा सा आगे की चीजें, बट लॉन्ग स्टोरी कट शॉर्ट, अभी इंडिया में जो भी कंपनी है, कोई भी किसी को पैसा दे सकता है, वो है. यस.
Can be tried only under the law which is prevailing at the time. So at the time of the donations, the law was something else. So retrospectively changing it changes it. But at the time, those sir,
प्लीज अंडरस्टैंड, आई अंडरस्टैंड योर कंसर्न कि सर ये आप ये रेट्रोस्पेक्टिवली जाके लॉ की डेफिनेशन चेंज कर दिए तो क्राइम तो प्रीवियस लॉ के अंडर था ना. प्लीज अंडरस्टैंड, व्हेन यू रीड पॉलिटी यू विल रीड दैट when it comes to a civil matter, retrospective amendment of laws can be done. When it comes to a criminal matter, retrospective amendments of laws cannot be done. है ना? तो सिविल है ये जो पढ़े हैं वो जो लिख रहे हैं लॉ वो सब पढ़ पढ़ के लिख रहे हैं. उनको बताया जाता है, मंत्री बोलता है देखो ऐसा बनाओ कुछ कि हमारा काम हो जाए, फिर अधिकारी बोलता है खोलो रे किताब, क्या बदलना है लॉ, बदल देते. राइट. So that is that. By the way, the electoral bond issue is still in the Supreme Court. Its constitutionality and legality has been challenged in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has not found time since the past 4 or 5 years to actually resolve this matter with urgency. Okay. चल रहा है जब तक सब चल रहा है. Right. So very nice. Now so coming back here, कहां से हम कहां पहुंच गए? But Australia, given Chinese interference, in the internal affairs, also was willing to take strong measures to limit Chinese influence in its affairs. Now, if this is clear, while these are reasons which I've told you why all of these countries are concerned about whom? China. Right? So they have a common strategic concern about dealing with the Chinese presence, and this can bring them together in the form of a grouping like Quad. But please understand, while it is one thing that they all have a certain amount of concern with China, and that is one strategic concern. We often say in IR, enemy is your friend. While India may share some of these concerns with all these players, the possibility of such a grouping materializing would depend not just on the fact that they all have a concern with whom? China, but also on how closely are they interlinked with each other. Even in 2017, let me give you this context. Between 2007 to 17, what is happening? Between 2007 to 17, what is happening? While they all have a concern with China, USA and India signed what? जो आप पढ़ेंगे आगे, ma'am will talk to you about the most historic deal, which is the US-India civil nuclear deal. Ma'am will discuss with you why it was considered a historic deal. The India-US civil nuclear deal of 2008, which involved India also getting a NPT exemption in the nuclear sector. ये डील क्यों हिस्टोरिक थी? Because of many reasons that madam will discuss with you. Long and short of it is this: the non-proliferation treaty was brought primarily to prevent countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. Okay, and basically one of its primary target when it was brought in NPT after 1967 was countries like India. To prevent countries like India from acquiring nuclear weapons. And India went ahead and acquired nuclear weapons nonetheless, did its tests and all of that. And USA also imposed sanctions on India in 1999, after 1998 Pokhran 2 tests, and even after the Pokhran 1, USA imposed sanctions on India, including economic sanctions on India. But 2008, 10 years later, USA itself led the efforts to allow India to do trade in nuclear energy with other countries without giving up its nuclear weapons. ये सारी कहानी वो डिटेल में अभी नहीं जा रहा हूं मैं, वो मैम बताएंगे आपको, ठीक है. He will talk about the nuclear aspect of the US-India civil nuclear deal. And basically, USA, the country which led initially efforts to impose sanctions on India for doing nuclear tests, was the country leading efforts at the international level to allow India to do trade in nuclear energy, whether nuclear reactors or enriched uranium, with other countries. Okay? आप लोगों का चेहरा देख के लगा नहीं सर कुछ खास तो समझ में आया. देखिए, एक एनपीटी द नॉन प्रोलिफरेशन ट्रीटी, ये कब आया? 1967 में. ठीक है, 67 के पहले जो ये P5 मेंबर्स है ना, ये सब ने न्यूक्लियर वेपन बना लिया. अब इन्होंने बोला आप कोई और मत बनाओ. अगर इफ यू विल नॉट मेक न्यूक्लियर वेपन्स, देन the P5 countries, they said that there is a bargain. If countries do not make nuclear weapons any further, then with all these countries they will share nuclear technology of making nuclear reactors and even enriched uranium, so that they could use this nuclear technology for peaceful or civilian purposes. India, which was the last country to do the nuclear tests? Out of the P5, the last country to do nuclear tests was China. China did nuclear tests in 1964-65 and 1962 में हम हार गए थे. So anyways, India had lost to China in the 62 war, and China acquiring nuclear weapons, the answer was clear, India has to acquire nuclear weapons. So in 67 they brought in this rule that no other country must acquire nuclear weapons. But India kept on working, and 74 mein we did the Pokhran 1. See, pre-independence India only started working on nuclear weapons. And you see that by 74 when India made nuclear weapons, India anyways in 1967 said no to signing whom? The NPT. इंडिया ने बोला ये क्या बात हुई, आप रखें न्यूक्लियर वेपन और हम नहीं रखें. इंडिया सेड दिस इज न्यूक्लियर अपार्थाइड. You are dividing the world into two groups. Those who will be allowed by law to have nuclear weapons. देखिए, law एक बड़ी unique चीज है. Many people confuse law with ethics. That every law is going to be a ethical law. ऐसा जरूरी नहीं है. India said ये NPT law is a discriminatory law. It is saying that P5 will have nuclear weapons, but no other country must acquire nuclear weapons. India said this is nuclear apartheid. Okay, you're dividing the world into nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. Said we will have none of this. And हमको नहीं चाहिए आपका टेक्नोलॉजी, यूरेनियम, फ्यूरेनियम, देख लेंगे. ठीक है. And you see by 74, India went ahead and did. Okay, and India did not sign NPT. And then again in 1998. And then in 1998, when India did the second round of tests, also sanctions were imposed on India. And there was also a certain amount of pressure on India to sign the NPT, which India anyways would not do. But 2008, the pressure on India to sign the NPT had disappeared. The country which had imposed sanctions on India, that is the US, was no longer. In 2001, by the way, they lifted the sanctions. 2001, they lifted the sanctions when Brijesh Mishra and was the NSA, and Jaswant Singh was the foreign minister, and the Vajpayee regime, Clinton paid a visit. Clinton administration had imposed the sanctions also, and it lifted the sanctions also very quickly. Just to give you the context, the whole Western world criticized India for doing the nuclear tests, except one major Western power, that is France. France did not criticize India's nuclear tests. Okay, nor did it support sanctions on India. ये बता रहा हूँ context, just एक basic knowledge के लिए. But by 2001 they lifted the sanctions, and by 2008 USA went ahead and argued with the NPT members that India must be given an exemption. Okay, India is a peaceful India said we are a peaceful nuclear power. We have a no first use policy. We should be given a exemption from NPT. Okay, we are a responsible nuclear power, etc., etc. And the same US, which had imposed sanctions on India, had led the formation of NPT, gave India the exemption and convinced other countries also to give India exemption, because NPT decisions are made by consensus. Okay, so USA led those efforts and got India the NPT exemption. It's a big deal in India-US relations. It showed that USA, देखिए जब आप पढ़ेंगे तो आपको बार बार बोला जाएगा कि after NPT waiver, India, US companies could now sell nuclear reactor or technology to India. But if you see, since the India-US civil nuclear deal, 2008 to what? 2022. Many years have passed, but not a single US nuclear reactor has been established in India. So many people say this nuclear deal is a failure. But it is not a failure, because the fact that USA was going out of its way to work closely with India was not driven merely by economics. It was driven by politics. That US and India, that India can be a potential partner for USA in the Asia Pacific. And so I told you, the Indian growth story looked promising. In 2008, India seemed to be the only other player in Asia which could possibly do what? Match China. The USA invested in that relationship, granting India the exemption. And you see, the biggest evidence of this was the NPT waiver. इस डील के समय हम पढ़ते थे, बहुत शोर मचा, बहुत बातें हुई. There were strong arguments made on many sides of should India enter into such a civil nuclear deal with USA or not. And there were all sorts of debates, discussions. But as जब मैम भी आपको पढ़ाएंगे, like Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister. Manmohan Singh's coalition partner was the Communist Party of India. Back then, the Communist Party or the left was somewhere. Now the left is nowhere left, as I say, in Indian politics. हो गए left के दिन, लद गए, खत्म है left. Okay. So Communist Party of India said, we will withdraw from our UPA coalition if Congress wants to sign NPT. If Congress wants to sign a civil nuclear deal with USA. By the way, the communists are not mad. They did have some valid points, but you can say they are mad anyway. So who cares? So, but still, they said there are many strong concerns, and India must not sign the US civil nuclear deal. Otherwise, if you sign, we will withdraw from the coalition, and the government may fall. Manmohan Singh said, so be it. Let the government fall. He went and signed the civil nuclear deal. The communists, the CPI withdrew. The CPI withdrew from the UPA coalition, and there was the possibility for the BJP to even move a no confidence motion against the UPA. But BJP said, we support the Congress on the civil nuclear deal. And the Samajwadis provided outside support to the Congress on this issue. मतलब कि वैसे तो हम सरकार में नहीं है, लेकिन इस इशू पे अगर नो कॉन्फिडेंस मोशन आएगा तो हम सरकार का समर्थन में.
वो बात अलग है कि कांग्रेस हैड द सीबीआई, देखिए ये चलता रहा है हमेशा, जिसके पास सीबीआई उसके बाद थोड़ा बहुत चलता है, बात करके देखो सुनो। तो एनीवेज, लॉन्ग स्टोरी कट शॉर्ट, the civil nuclear deal went through. There was a cross-party political consensus in India also that USA is a relationship to invest in. And the civil nuclear deal was the biggest example of this. Even though not a single reactor has been set up since then in India, the fact that both countries were going out of the way to make the deal happen shows how strongly they were willing to invest in the relationship. तो रिएक्टर तो नहीं आया उसके बाद, but since then USA and India's defense relationship grew steadily. Okay, and India started importing more defense platforms, etc., from USA. So clearly, the India-US civil nuclear deal, the US-India defense relationship witnessed what? The India-US defense relationship witnessed a certain amount of deepening. There were joint military exercises called as the Malabar. ओबामा आए इंडिया, वो उन्होंने जॉइंट पार्लियामेंट को एड्रेस, पार्लियामेंट का लोकसभा राज्यसभा का एक जॉइंट सेशन एड्रेस किया. ओके, ही सेड द वर्ल्ड्स लार्जेस्ट एंड द वर्ल्ड्स ओल्डेस्ट डेमोक्रेसी आर बट नेचुरल एलाइज. ऐसी बड़ी बड़ी बातें. एंड बैक देन ओबामा को देख के भारतीय आई थी एकदम फुल टू, हम यहीं रहते थे तब भी, घर से निकलना बाहर मुश्किल हो गया था, इतनी सिक्योरिटी थी. तो हाँ, कम वो तो अभी की बात है, लिमोआ, कमकासा, सिस्मोआ, ऑल ऑफ दोस थिंग्स. जॉइंट मिलिट्री एक्सरसाइजेस, यस, फॉर एग्जांपल द मालाबार एक्सरसाइजेस. And also, if you see in terms of deeper military cooperation, since yes, military cooperation between both the sides, there have been efforts at having deeper cooperation through measures such as the logistical exchange memorandum of agreement, COMCASA, SISMOA, ये सब आप पढ़ लेंगे इंडिया यूएस में. Basically, these were foundational agreements. US military cannot work with another country unless countries sign these, what USA calls as foundational agreements for interoperability of their forces. Meaning, if US Navy has to work with the Indian Navy, they have to do communication with each other. So for that communication, they need to have a dedicated infrastructure on the ships, softwares, satellite, all of which is encrypted. So that is there. If USA ships need to refuel on Indian, what? Please understand why in the whole world USA wants to have military bases. Because if US Navy has to operate far away from its shores, it needs to refuel, it needs maintenance, it should be able to do so. So if you call it this as, these are agreements on LEMOA, in सबकी details में नहीं जा रहा हूं मैं. Basically, these agreements would allow logistical interoperability of forces, whether it is refueling, refurbishment, or repair also if required, or encrypted communications between forces. For that to happen, these agreements have to be signed, and they have been more or less completed now. Okay, and ये सब भी कब हो रहा है? 2014 to 17 के बीच में. But these are part of the larger pattern. और बेक्का भी आया था एक. Okay, जो भी, so basically would allow a greater cooperation and interoperability between whom? Indian and US forces. ठीक है. So clearly who's coming together? India and US. Needless to say, I told you, India US trade also jumped significantly. So clearly who are working together? India and US in the defense sphere have a common strategic concern with respect to the rise of China and even closer economic cooperation. और हमारा Indian diaspora working in US, वो सब है. Now India and US were anyways coming together at this time, and you see obviously US has close relations with whom? Japan, and USA also has close relations with whom? Australia. And as I'll discuss with you the India-Japan relationship briefly, separately, India and Japan also were coming closer to each other between 2007 to 2017 in a major way. Japan gave the highest civilian order, something equivalent to our Bharat Ratna. To whom? Manmohan Singh. The outgoing Indian Prime Minister in the UPA 2 administration was given the highest civilian honor by the Japanese. That's one thing. Even in the economic sphere, there was closer cooperation. And I'll say, as I'll explain later, about Japan, in many other economic areas, developmental areas, etc., there was closer cooperation. India and Japan were clearly coming close to each other. All these parties are coming close to each other, and that is what makes Quad possible. Okay, that a decade was spent to realize partly the ever growing concerns about Chinese assertiveness, but also to build closer synergy between whom? Potential Quad partners. And then 2017 Doklam happened. Shinzo Abe was just in another, he had come back to power in Japan and he again pitched the idea of Quad, and now it happened. वही इंसान, वही आइडिया 10 साल में बहुत कुछ बदल गया. Right? So the time had finally arrived for that idea. Who had come to power 2017 तक? Trump. Trump is like, ये तो करना है. Japan anyways wanted to do it. India also, Doklam, India also wanted to do it. Australia also wanted to do it. And there was a certain degree of increasing convergence in economic trade and other areas also between whom? India and the other Quad partners. And so Quad became possible. As a prelude to this, and देखिए, after this, once Quad's idea was given, इसके बाद हुई असली भसड़ चालू. What is Quad? बोल तो दिया बना रहे हैं Quad. But what is Quad? Is Quad a military alliance? India never said that it was a military alliance. Okay. India never said it was a military alliance because India said that we never enter into alliances. हम करते ही नहीं enter into alliances. So it's not a military alliance, nor is it directed at any particular country. But while India said so about Quad, then question was, ठीक है, चलो नहीं है military alliance, तो क्या है? It is not. एक होता है, आप जीवन में क्या करना चाहते हैं? आप बोला मैं ये नहीं करना चाहता. That doesn't mean आपने ये बता दिया कि आप क्या करना चाहते हैं. Right? Basically, India refuted initially the argument that it is not, that it is a military alliance. India said it is not a military alliance. But at the same time, India was already doing the Malabar exercises with whom? US. And after Quad came as the idea, around the same time, India included Japan, and the bilateral military exercises of naval exercises of the Malabar now became trilateral. ये कब हुआ? Doklam के बाद. Before Doklam, India would not allow Japan into the India-US military exercises because China objected, saying, "Dekho, you are ganging up alliance against China." So India would not allow it. India did not allow it before Doklam, but Doklam happened. India said, "Ho gaya bas ab to." Then what happened? Galwan. And India said, "अरे तुम कहां थे? कौन? आ जाओ." Quadrilateral military exercises in a way of these four navies operating with each other, doing joint exercises in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea region. But India said 2020 में नहीं है ये military alliance. Quad is not a military alliance. While we may do interoperability exercises with other navies, Quad is not a military alliance. सवाल बार बार यही आ रहा था कि then what is Quad? नहीं है, चलो मान लिया. What will Quad do? So they had to figure out an agenda for Quad. If India was saying it is not a military alliance. So because China said, hey, it is Asian NATO, they are forming a NATO-like alliance to contain China. You know, this is the kind of stuff which triggers wars, and all of these are basically teaming up to gang up against China. नहीं ऐसा नहीं है. Okay. Now, Quad thus was yet to conceive of an idea. And in 2002, क्या हुआ? 2020 came the idea of what? In which Australia, UK and US, they would enter into a joint contract or which would allow, under which Australia would be supplied with almost the know-how, technology transfer, training to build almost 10 nuclear submarines. Does India know how to make nuclear submarines? India is in the process, has already done a certain number of trials of its indigenously made nuclear submarines of the Arihant class or group. But does India have a functional nuclear submarine? Yes. एक है हमारे पास. Given to us by whom? Russia. The only nuclear submarine which is operable right now has been transferred to India by Russia. In fact, the training to Indian naval forces in using nuclear submarines also has been given by Russia. India कितने aircraft carrier? पहले 2 थे, अभी कुछ एक तीसरा आ गया ऑलमोस्ट, तो चल रहा ट्रायल. लेकिन पहला एयरक्राफ्ट कैरियर गिवन टू इंडिया बाय रशिया, Admiral Gorshov, or what was called as the INS Vikramaditya. Okay. Now, it's a very, वैसे इससे पता चलता है कि एक चीज आपको जो पता लगता है कि whenever it came to the highest end technology, whether aircraft carriers to nuclear submarines to now the missile defense system, Russia has been a strong and a reliable partner in the security arena. With whom? India. Now, see, Russia एक ऐसी चीज है जिसपे Indians have never made up their mind. When I say present day Indians, past Indians का तो clear था कि भाई रशिया हमारा, हम रशिया के, तुम बचाओ हमें, बस टाइप्स. बट देखिए आजकल क्या होता है कि लोग बोलते हैं कि यार साला रशिया, सोवियत यूनियन, these all things of the past. Today in India, for example, the communists have always had a certain degree of strong affection for the Soviet Union and then Russia. So ये तो कौन थे लेफ्ट वाले. आजकल राइट वालों को भी बहुत प्यार आ रहा है. They like, look at Putin. We need leaders like Putin. So what Putin is to Ukraine, what China is to Taiwan, that is what India should be to fill in the blanks. Yes, Pakistan. They never say this is what India should be to China. They never say that a strong leader like India, China. हमको पता है किसको ठोकना है, कहां अपना पोटेंशियल है ना? तो this is there. So today Indians have this fascination for whom? Russia. Right वाले भी, left वालों का तो हमेशा ही था. तो good thing left and right today agree on one thing. Russia. Left always said good relations with Russia is an important part of India's security. It is an important part of India's security apparatus. The right also agrees. There is what? Consensus. मैंने बोला ना एक मेच्योर डेमोक्रेसी में, अब आप बोलेंगे सर मेच्योर नहीं है हमारी डेमोक्रेसी, मैं बोल रहा हूं इंडियन डेमोक्रेसी, आई एम सेइंग ऑन अ सर्टेन नोट ऑफ सीरियसनेस, इज स्टिल अ relatively mature democracy. For example, when it comes to foreign policy, there is a certain degree of consensus, cross political party consensus in India. Whoever comes to power, whether it is the UPA or the NDA or tomorrow, God knows, even if an Aam Aadmi gets in love with a Mamata Banerjee supported by some Samajwadis here and some the DMKs there, still they will support a India-US relationship or a India-Russia relationship. There is a certain degree of consensus and maturity, at least on certain matters. So what you see is, coming back here, what you see is that Australia was supplied these nuclear submarines by whom? UK and US. They've signed an agreement under which over the next 10 years, Australia will be supplied and manufacturing will also be done in Australia. Technology will be shared with Australia. And over the next 10 or 15 years, Australia will have 10 nuclear submarines. Patrolling where? Patrolling in the Pacific region. Patrolling the Pacific Ocean. And the idea is clearly it will help in dealing with Chinese naval presence. Please understand, पहली बात ये न्यूक्लियर सबमरीन हैं, तो it doesn't mean that they are always carrying nuclear weapons. They are powered by a nuclear reactor. देखिए सबमरीन बड़ी अच्छी चीज होती है, ऐसी होती है पनडुब्बी, है ना? इसके अंदर होता है न्यूक्लियर रिएक्टर. That is why you're calling this a nuclear submarine. It may or may not carry nuclear weapons. So please understand, Australian nuclear submarines will not carry nuclear weapons. आपको लग रहा हो कि सर मैं बता रहा हूं ना, ये लगा होगा इस पे तो बम न्यूक्लियर वाला. न्यूक्लियर सबमरीन पे न्यूक्लियर बम लगाना बहुत बम वाला काम, बम वाला काम है, दम वाला काम नहीं है, बम वाला काम. I'll explain very briefly. Nuclear bombs are never kept in an assembled position. They are always kept in an unassembled state. The bomb is kept separate. The missile is kept separate. When it comes to where? Land or air. Meaning, if you were to use a nuclear weapon on a BrahMos missile, the weapon and the missile are never kept together. One day, one fine general says, लगाओ यार इस पे चला दें आज, वहां हो जाएगा. अभी हुआ था, गलती हो गई सर, गलती. This is the reason they are neither kept together or assembled, nor are given the control to one single authority. The DRDO handles the weapons. The Army or the Air Force has the missiles. ऐसे नहीं कि पता चला एक ही को दे दिया, किसी ने बोला कि चलो आज देख ले, है ना. बट दिस अप्लाइज टू लैंड एंड एयर. इन न्यूक्लियर पावर्ड और इवन डीजल सबमरीन्स, चाहे जो इंजन हो वो न्यूक्लियर रिएक्टर से चले या डीजल से चले, it doesn't matter. In submarines, if you keep nuclear weapons, they are kept in an assembled position. Assembled position means the possibility of them being fired either by mistake or a rogue general increases. लेकिन फिर भी ऐसा नहीं है कि वह अंदर बैठे बस बम चलो आज चला ही देते हैं. Even in this, there are checks and balances, but they're not that strong as compared to land-based arsenal or air-based arsenal. होता है यहाँ पे भी है, there's a passcode which comes, this, that, whatever. It's pretty complex, we don't know. It is not like it is shown in movies. ये मैं बता दूं. पिक्चर में जैसे दिखाते हैं वैसा नहीं है बस. So that is there. However, basically, so let's not get into this much. What I'm trying to say is, but still, whether they carry nuclear weapons or not, even carrying conventional weapons, what is the advantage of a nuclear submarine is that it can remain underwater for longer periods as compared to a diesel submarine. At least for 2-3 months, it can remain underwater without the need to come to the surface for air. इसीलिए न्यूक्लियर सबमरीन इंपॉर्टेंट होती है, that it is difficult to detect underwater by radars. It can remain, submarines are detected when they come to the surface for air by radars. If you remain underwater for months altogether without the need to come to the surface for air, then you can simply be in the ocean undetected for months, okay, and for 2 to 3 months at a time, and that is a big enough period. So you can practically be there in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, sitting there, and if the Chinese do anything, you can mount a immediate response without the Chinese being able to track you. That is why nuclear submarines are important, even if they are not carrying nuclear weapons. ठीक है. कितना कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी तक जाएंगे अपन लोगों को, एक बेसिक समझना है ना, इतना ही, इससे ज्यादा अपने को नहीं समझना है. तो दिस इज व्हाई दीज सबमरीन्स विल अलाउ द नेवी लार्जर इंटरऑपरेटेबिलिटी, अवॉइड डिटेक्शन एंड माउंट अ डेटरेंट रिस्पॉन्स टू और माउंट अ काउंटर ऑफेंसिव अगेंस्ट चाइना इफ नीडेड. डज चाइना हैव 10 न्यूक्लियर सबमरीन्स? नहीं है चाइना के पास 10 nuclear submarines. China doesn't have. India has one. China has, I think, 3 or 4, whatever. India has one. Abhi दूसरी भी I think is almost there, which India is indigenously making. So India will have probably another one out in a couple of years. But no other player in this region has nuclear submarines. USA is practically introducing a new fleet of nuclear submarines in the Pacific oceans by contracting it out to Australia. China, is it going to be happy with such a situation? Not at all. China said, you are what? Nuclearizing the Pacific. And a concern also has been that if USA gives 10 or 15 years time in which Australia will get or will manufacture these nuclear weapons, in that time period China is not going to sit quietly. China will go ahead and expand its own fleet of nuclear submarines. You are triggering an arms race in the region. You're introducing new arms. In response, the Chinese are also going to build a whole fleet of nuclear submarine. इंडिया से देखो ऑकस को, देखो दिख रहा उसमें इंडिया? नहीं. इंडिया से ये क्या है? मिलिट्री अलायंस. हम क्या नहीं है? India is not involved in arms race. India is not involved in military alliance. India is not getting involved in an effort to contain China. हमने सीधे पल्ला झाड़ लिया. From whom? AUKUS. India said India has nothing to do with AUKUS. India did not criticize AUKUS. India said it has nothing to do with AUKUS. India said Quad is not an Asian NATO. It is a lazy explanation to say that Quad is Asian NATO. Did China criticize Quad? Yes. Did China criticize NATO? Did China criticize AUKUS? Yes. Did Russia criticize Quad? Yes. Russia criticized Quad. Russia criticized the idea of Quad. And India is a member of Quad. And India and Russia have good. लेकिन दोस्ती अपनी जगह. हम अलायंस में तो देखो आते नहीं है. The buzzword is strategic autonomy. इंडिया रशिया रिलेशंस अपनी जगह हैं, बट क्वाड अपनी जगह. India said Quad is not country specific. It doesn't target China. It wants to maintain open access to sea, rule based international order. ये सब पूरी full कहानी. But Russia made its Russia made its discontent with the idea of Quad openly openly voiced its discontent with Quad. China said it's an Asian NATO. India still went ahead with Quad. AUKUS, India distanced itself from AUKUS. But did India criticize AUKUS? No. But ये सवाल का जवाब नहीं दिया अभी तक हमने कि क्वाड करेगा क्या, है ना. तो so India distanced itself from AUKUS, but on Quad this question had to be answered. What is the agenda of Quad? If Quad doesn't have a clear agenda, then it will be a useless organization. There are many such useless organizations India is now a part of. IBSA, अब तो लोग नाम भी नहीं लेते इसका. इंडिया, ब्राजील, साउथ अफ्रीका, ये अभी है इंडिया. इसका जब आया था तो हमने पढ़ा था 3 countries, 3 democracies. हम बड़े टाइम में आई थी. 3 continents, है ना. सब हो गया. ठीक है. तो ऑर्गेनाइज रीजनल ग्रुपिंग्स आर फॉर्म्ड. One of the reasons why IBSA failed was it did not have a very clearly defined agenda, which was something that all countries, member states were equally working towards. Some said, "Arey na Quad military alliance hai," and if Quad doesn't have an agenda, then Quad will also be a useless talking shop. It is not a military alliance. ना आप कह रहे हैं तो क्या है? कुछ नहीं है ना. So at this time, India and other Quad members clarified that yes, Quad is not a military alliance. We have an agenda for Quad in mind. So, arriving at an agenda for Quad, it was argued that member states would work towards closer cooperation in and this is by 2020. Closer cooperation in launching, firstly, joint missions towards addressing key issues such as semiconductor or towards addressing key issues such as joint development in the semiconductor industry sector, 5G telecom equipment sector. कोविड हो गया था तो क्या? Joint development of vaccines. And their distribution where? In Asia and Africa. इसमें ये कहा गया था कि USA, etc., and US companies will share certain technologies with and set up manufacturing bases in India, and almost 1 billion doses of the COVID vaccine will be distributed by Quad. Where? Quad members in Asia and Africa. देखिए, COVID period was a time also of rivalry between China and other countries of winning hearts and minds. देखिए भाई, पूरी दुनिया ने किसको ब्लेम किया? चाइना. वुहान वायरस ये वो. तो चाइना said, अरे कुछ तो करो to counter the negative public opinion against China. China said, let's make vaccine and distribute it. जहां it will build goodwill for China in these countries. Chinese vaccine though has relatively lower efficacy than many other vaccines, and but still China is like कि हम देते हैं, other countries anyways like okay, it will build goodwill. So this is a part of the Chinese vaccine diplomacy. India also did its own vaccine diplomacy, and the Quad members were willing to do so. Joint development of vaccines, semiconductor, 5G telecom, and apart from these areas, on certain other key issues, and this is important, kya? China has what? BRI. Through ideas such as the Blue Dot Network or through the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor project, jointly fund and support the development of infrastructure projects where in developing countries. How? In a which manner? Sustainable. मतलब क्या? Give an option to whom? Give an option to whom? Give an option to the developing countries that they need not take loans from whom? China. That the Japanese, that the Americans, that the Indians must come together to provide loans, grants, etc., technical know-how to other developing countries so that they have an alternative to BRI if they want to fund their infrastructure projects. ये Blue Dot Network क्या है? Briefly बता रहा हूं आपको. Blue Dot Network basically is a US-based certification scheme. Broadly, बस समझने के लिए बता रहा हूं. It's a US supported certification scheme. देखिए आप बोलते हैं ना Zomato पे and Swiggy you rate what? Zomato, Swiggy you rate restaurants. On Zomato, Swiggy you rate restaurants and say कि अच्छा इसका food quality ऐसा है, hygiene ऐसा है, ये ऐसा है, pricing ऐसा है, timely delivery etc. In a similar way, USA has said that they'll make a list of all potential projects in developing countries which want or need funding and rate these projects on how economically viable they are. So projects, say if you want to build a highway, suppose you are a country, say a Sri Lanka, who wants to raise funds to build a port in Sri Lanka. Then USA will do a viability study of that project. And by doing a viability study of that project, give a rating to that project, saying ki, hypothetically speaking, ki out of 5 stars, we give 2 stars to this project as far as its economic viability is concerned. Or when it comes to environmental impact of such a project, we give it 3 stars. Or when it comes to the bidding procedure, we give it 1 star. है ना कि bidding होगी कि नहीं होगी, so that bidding नहीं है तो corruption होने का chance ज़्यादा है and all that. So on this basis, a rating of every project will be created. Once this rating is done, then an objective assessment can be made of which projects are viable and not viable. Those which are viable will be given funding. Okay. So this is the Blue Dot network. And so इन सारी चीजों पे हम काम करेंगे. Who? All the Quad members. And also they have a larger concern of maintaining wahi dharra, rule-based international order, free and open Indo-Pacific. But what are we not? Free and open Indo-Pacific. Yes. So if this all was happening at this time, yes. If these all steps were being taken, Quad and AUKUS. ये क्वेश्चन आया था आपके मेंस एग्जाम में यही. Quad is not a military alliance but has significant economic potential for cooperation in economic and human development arenas as well. Or has potential also, question was for has significant potential for cooperation in economic and political arena as well. And it is not a military alliance. तो क्या arguments हैं ये आपको पता होना चाहिए. We have been saying it is not a military alliance but political cooperation. What? This is political cooperation. और इकोनॉमिक कोऑपरेशन क्या है? ये सब दिस इज पॉलिटिकल कोऑपरेशन. दिस इज क्या? ऑल ऑफ दिस इज व्हाट? All of this is economic cooperation, the semiconductor, the 5G telecom, infrastructure, vaccines, all of this is what economic cooperation. But please tell me, an underlying motive of this economic cooperation is to diversify away from China. Because a large number of these semiconductor manufacturing bases are in China. A large number of potential telecom equipment suppliers for 5G networks, including Huawei, etc., are Chinese companies. While the Blue Dot Network, etc., and the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor do not explicitly mention BRI, but they want to offer an alternative to whom? BRI. Economics is closely in bed with politics. Though in public they may appear separately, but in reality they are closely in sync with each other. Right? So please understand, in the world of international politics, when it comes to major actors and their relations with each other, relations are not purely governed by economics, nor are they purely governed by politics. It's often a mix of two. And politics may in certain conditions become a driving force, even driving closer economic cooperation between countries, as you see in the form of what? Question is then, what is India's stand on AUKUS? I told you India distanced itself from AUKUS. But the impact on India, एक तो है what is India's stand, वो मैंने बता दिया. इंडिया का स्टैंड भाई हमारा कोई लेना देना नहीं है. But what is the impact of AUKUS on India or India's interests? There are two viewpoints. ये लास्ट देखिए, that is the reason मैं बोल रहा हूँ ना कि किताबें पढ़ने का कोई खास फायदा है नहीं यार आप लोगों के एग्जाम लेवल पे फॉर जीएस, बिकॉज ये सब बातें अभी हैं, ये जब तक बुक्स में आएंगी, ये सारी चीजें बुक्स में आएंगी. इवेंचुअली ऑल ऑफ दिस विल बिकम पार्ट ऑफ बुक्स व्हेन बुक्स आर अपडेटेड. दैट विल टेक अ कपल ऑफ इयर्स, जब तक आपका एग्जाम हो चुका होगा. तो फिर क्या होता है, बच्चों को लगता है कि किताब से सवाल आया. देखिए यूपीएससी में एक प्रॉब्लम क्या है, problem is this, that people believe that, oh, the answer of this question is in this book. आपने क्वेश्चन देखा 2020 में, लेकिन वो क्वेश्चन था 2018 का, और वो 2020 की बुक में आपको उसका आंसर मिल गया. आपको लगा क्वेश्चन तो इसी बुक से आता है. सब कुछ नहीं है. इस बुक को लेके 2021 का पेपर सॉल्व कर लीजिए, अगर हो जाता है तो ठीक है, वरना फिर वही होगा. 2021 का क्वेश्चन 2022 की बुक से सॉल्व हो जाएगा. टाइम मशीन तो है नहीं कि आगे जाके बुक पढ़ के पीछे वापस आ गए. राइट. मोस्ट ऑफ द गाइड बुक्स व्हाट दे डू इज वो क्वेश्चन पेपर लेते हैं, उससे आए. देखिए, इस दुनिया में कई तरह के जुमले हैं, है ना. सो दिस इज द थिंग दैट जस्ट बिकॉज यू आर एबल टू यूज अ गाइड बुक टू आंसर यूपीएससी क्वेश्चंस means questions are coming from that guide book. That is not the case. Most guidebooks cannot give potential questions or answers because they are often retrospectively amended. ठीक है, तो don't get into this trap. इसमें IR related चीज में it's more better to rely just on class work and material provided, and that's kind of enough. So what is the impact of what AUKUS on India's interests? Impact of AUKUS on India's interests. One potential viewpoint is that the formulation of a grouping like AUKUS would have, or the formulation of a grouping like AUKUS would indirectly whom? Benefit whom? India. Would indirectly benefit India. Why? Because it will play an active role in in containing Chinese naval presence in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and it would complement whom? Indian naval strength in the Indian Ocean region, in the Indian Ocean, it would complement India's naval strength, which is primarily based in which ocean? Indian Ocean. It would complement India's naval strength, which is primarily located, or which is primarily in the Indian Ocean region. देखिए मतलब क्या, मतलब इसका पॉइंट एकदम सिंपल है. ये ताइवान, ये जापान, ये मलेशिया, इंडोनेशिया, यहां पे what? AUKUS and the naval strength becomes the predominant power where? South China and the East China Sea. और यहां पे कौन? Indian Navy. Indo-Pacific में the Indian Navy on the one side and the AUKUS naval powers on the other work together. मतलब इंडिया की नेवी एक तरफ और US, UK and Australian Navy on the other side work together. This will partly address one weakness of one weakness of Quad जो मैंने अभी तक बताई नहीं आपको. देखिए क्वाड में ना एक्सेप्ट whom US एंड इंडिया कौन है? Except US and India, apart from US and India, who's there? Japan and Australia. I'll give you one example. If you take US out of the picture, then the combined military strength of India, Japan and Australia put together is also not equal to that of China. The military expenditures of India, Japan and Australia put together are also not equal to that of China. China इतना spend करता है अपनी military पे. Spend up till 3% of their GDP on defense. We also spend something 2.25-3% इसके बीच में वो करते हैं. हम भी उतना ही कुछ कर रहे हैं. But उनका GDP size बहुत बड़ा है. So they spend much more than India. Right? But India, Japan, Australia put together भी इतना spend नहीं करते हैं in total terms on military as China spends alone. Without US, there will be no Quad. But that obviously is known. Without US, there will be no Quad. What is not known is that without, often what is not partly acknowledged by the other Quad members is that without India also, there will be no Quad. India is the only player in this region which has a vast naval fleet, had a strategic presence along the Andaman and Nicobar Island, has 2 aircraft carriers which are operational, has a nuclear submarine, है ना? ये बाकियों का नहीं है इतना, ठीक है? So clearly, are all players equally competent in Quad? No, they are not. Who's competent? UK. Before US, who was the world's biggest naval power? UK. They're back in the field by entering into AUKUS. Australia, whose naval fleet is not a very elaborate fleet, will receive a boost in its capability. है ना? तो कुछ क्वाड मेंबर्स तो ऑकस मेंबर्स भी हैं ही ना. So once their capabilities are boosted, it will complement quad. It will complement India's efforts. ये है पॉइंट. ठीक है, ये एक व्यू पॉइंट है. कंसर्न क्या है भैया? कंसर्न क्या है? एक कंसर्न इज दिस, it will trigger an arms race in the region. If it triggers the arms race in the region, the formation of AUKUS, China will go ahead developing a larger number of nuclear submarines. है ना? और इंडिया तो 10 बना नहीं पाएगा. Not does India need maybe 10. Please understand, India's defense expenditures will be guided by Indian objectives. But if China is coaxed into developing more nuclear submarines, it will tilt the balance of power in favor of whom? Chinese Navy as compared to whom? Indian Navy. इंडिया ने बोला ना क्वाड क्या नहीं है? मिलिट्री अलायंस. ठीक है, that's one. The second concern, so in fact that's the प्राइमरी कंसर्न. एक कंसर्न और जो बोला गया है वो ये है कि राइट नाउ यूएसए इज हेविली डिपेंडेंट ऑन हुम इफ दे वांट टू टैकल चाइना इन द नेवल स्फीयर. राइट नाउ दे हैव टू प्राइमरीली रिलाई ऑन हुम एज द अदर मेजर नेवल पावर? इंडिया, है ना? बट the Indian Navy's overwhelming presence in the Indian Ocean region makes it a preeminent power in the region right now. But अगर ऑस्ट्रेलिया ने 10 न्यूक्लियर सबमरीन बना ली तो फिर इंडिया की उतनी जरूरत शायद नहीं रही. और यूएस may not need India as a closer defense partner if Australia develops that kind of nuclear submarine capabilities to patrol the South China and the East China Sea. So India's importance to US may decline. Okay. So that देखिए एकदम सिंपल सी बात है ना, इंडिया ने बड़ा क्लियर कर रखा है यूएस को. देखो, we will not fight somebody else's war. हम किसी और की लड़ाई नहीं लड़ेंगे. मतलब we have a disputes with China over an Aksai chain, over Arunachal, and maybe to some extent in the Indian Ocean region. But that doesn't mean that we will do what US says. और ये US बोल रहा है कि देखो ऐसा है, on Taiwan we will attack China from east. Hey India, you attack from west. India is like, क्यों भैया? Please understand, if tomorrow a Taiwan US confrontation happens, if China US confrontation happens on Taiwan, US says we are deploying troops in the South China Sea and the East China Sea and launches an offensive against China in the South China and East China Sea and expects India to launch a simultaneous offensive against China. The past track record of India tells US cannot take Indian cooperation for granted. बार बार आप देखते होंगे पढ़ा रहता, लिखा रहता है आर्टिकल. US must not take India for granted. अरे हम नहीं है जापान ऑस्ट्रेलिया, हमारे पास है अपना वेपन, न्यूक्लियर भी, सबमरीन भी, एयरक्राफ्ट कैरियर भी, देख लेंगे. So India's self-sufficiency is partly something that is a matter of concern for whom? US. Because US cannot take India's cooperation for granted. Okay. And US knows that if there is one power in the region which can hold its own against China, then it is whom? India. While they want cooperation with India, they know India cannot be easily dictated terms. More so when it has a strong leader. है ना. तो अभी तक मैं लीडरशिप की तो बात ही नहीं करी, मैं तो सिर्फ यही बात कर रहा हूं. हार्ड कोर material and economic strength of the country itself dictates that it is not a pushover in the region. And this is why the Americans find it so difficult to understand India. Many are like, Arey, how can you? Because India is like, you know, whether it's on Russia, I told you, right? Russia said, bhai, Russia often, in fact, has demonstrated much better understanding of India's strategic concerns than whom? US. Partly because of the long relationship between the two also, close relationship. And US kind of finds it difficult to understand that why India always wants an exception. I gave you the NPT exception. दुनिया NPT साइन कर रही है, हम बोले ना हम NPT साइन करेंगे और हमको ट्रेड भी करने दो. The only country ever granted a NPT exemption is whom? And that too when India had weak leadership. Pre-independence India. Now तो India is strong and has strong leadership. अब तो बात ही नहीं सुनने की अन्य किसी की. Right? So history tells that they cannot take us for granted. Why do you think they have pushed on AUKUS? Because the history of UK, Australia and US relationship has been of closer alliance partners. They are formal alliance partners of each other. India has never been anybody's alliance partner. More so, not US alliance partner. US knows push comes to shove. If it needs complete support in more or less an unconditional manner, it cannot count on whom? India. India may not be willing to do anybody else's bidding or fight anybody else's war. US says, साला यही प्रॉब्लम तुम्हारा, पहले नॉन अलाइनमेंट चलता था, अभी ये स्ट्रेटेजिक ऑटोनॉमी परेशान हो गए आपकी ऑटोनॉमी से. US policymakers often say we don't understand India is in which camp. India says we are in our own camp. Okay, so this is the implications of what? The concerns around AUKUS. Right? That the concerns are that it may trigger a larger nuclear or larger arms race in the Indo-Pacific, and spur China into vastly expanding its fleet of whom? Nuclear submarines. Vastly expanding its fleet of nuclear submarines and thus militarize the Indo-Pacific further. देखिए दुनिया में जब जब आर्म्स रेस हुई है, जब जब लड़ाई हुई है, वर्ल्ड वॉर 1 के पहले देयर वाज अ आर्म्स रेस बिटवीन जर्मनी एंड ब्रिटेन. ब्रिटेन हैड द वर्ल्ड्स बिगेस्ट नेवल फ्लीट, जर्मनी सेड हम भी बनाएंगे नेवल फ्लीट. हो गई लड़ाई. आर्म्स रेस हुई तो आर्म्स बनाया तो ऐसे थोड़ी है कि रखने के लिए बनाया, एक दो तो चला के देख लें. And secondly, India's concerns have been this, that it may diminish, or AUKUS activities may diminish Indian Navy's preeminent role in the कहां It may diminish India's Navy's preeminent role in the Indo-Pacific region. ठीक है, कोई वे फॉरवर्ड नहीं है इसका. वे फॉरवर्ड यही है, क्वाड क्वाड चले, ऑकस ऑकस. ठीक है. I hope this is clear. Any doubts till here? Any questions you people have till here? If India and China go to war with each other, will US help India? I have no clue. But this much can be said for sure. India has been doing its military planning and will be doing its military planning in the future, taking into account that the worst case scenario is that India is going to act alone. You should always prepare for the worst and hope for the best. तो कर रहे हैं military exercises, quadrilateral, मतलब वो मालाबार में सबके साथ. If push comes to shove, a war breaks out, India may request cooperation with like-minded partners. And if they are ready to cooperate, we have the past experience of doing joint military exercises, having the possibility of inter-operations quickly. But even if that is not possible, हम अकेले, we should be capable enough that we are going to act alone. अरे कौन आ रहा है डोकलम में? गलवान में हो गए 2 साल, कोई आया? कोई नहीं आया, right? है ना? So that is why you have to be आत्म, right? जो शब्द अच्छा लगे लिख दीजिएगा. आत्मनिर्भर फॉरेन पॉलिसी लिख सकते, खुश हो जाएगा एग्जाम में. क्या बात, बगल में आप बना दीजिए. बनाना मत है, it's kidding. So yeah.
With respect to all of this, when India says that we can hold ourselves or we are self-sufficient, given the difference between India and China's military and economy, how much can we actually hold ourselves?
नहीं, please understand, it's a valid question and मैम से भी आप डिस्कस कर लीजिएगा कि how capable is, what he's asking is how, while we keep saying that India can hold its own against China, how capable is India of doing so? India is capable. It has demonstrated even in the case of Galwan. Okay, that yes, to whatever is my understanding, let me say with a qualifier, because I'm not an expert on these matters. But to whatever is my understanding, India has made significant, क्यों गलवान हुआ and all that is partly because of India doing a lot of modernization of infrastructure in the border areas, including in the Aksai Chin areas, and that partly triggered China. In Doklam, for 70 days, India demonstrated the resolve not ceding ground to China. The Chinese policymakers partly expected India to buckle under pressure. It did not happen in Galwan. And then in Doklam, it did not happen in Doklam in 2017. The Chinese expected Indians to give in to the pressure, but it did not happen. The Indian side stood its ground. And then in 2020 also, there is a tense border standoff, there's a killing of troops, India reclaimed some of the lost posts, and on some areas there's still standoff which has continued for 2 long winters now, which is unparalleled. Nobody has held ground against China for so long. Okay, so India has demonstrated the capacity as well as the resolve of holding against China. इसमें हमेशा एक बात ये भी कहा जाता है कि जब लड़ाई होती भी है अगर, तो what is your objective in war? Is it an offensive objective or is it a defensive objective? Please understand, while India may not have the capability to launch a large-scale counter-offensive against China to grab Chinese territory, India says that's not even our aim. Our aim is to be strong enough to deter any Chinese attack. So while offensive capabilities of India to capture Chinese territories may be limited, but in defensive capabilities we are significantly there. ये एक broad position agreed upon है. And amongst China's neighbors, India is the only one, perhaps, which is not a pushover. Okay, obviously apart from Russia. Okay, so that much has to be given to the Indian capabilities as well. इतना मैं आपको बता सकता हूं, इतना मुझे पता. अब उनकी एयरफोर्स कितनी स्ट्रांग है, हमारी कितनी स्ट्रांग है, वो मारेंगे तो क्या होगा, हमें मेरे को नहीं पता भाई. आई एम नॉट अ मिलिट्री स्ट्रैटेजिस्ट. ये सब काम वही कर सकते हैं जो जनरल वनरल हो बहुत टाइम से, उनको पता है कौन सी पहाड़ी कहाँ है, कौन से स्क्वाड्रन कहाँ है, किसमें कितने प्लेन हैं, हो गई लड़ाई तो क्या करेंगे. ये सब हमारा काम नहीं है ना. इट्स ऑलवेज गुड टू नो कि आपको क्या नहीं पता है, पहले ही मान लेना चाहिए. बट हाँ ना, एग्जाम में कोई पूछेगा. यस यस वह ट्रेडिंग फर्म. हाँ. नहीं, so basically one of the things what you're asking is that Quad seems to be an organization driven largely by an economic agenda, whereas it has shifted its focus probably say from military focus to economic focus, and its primary focus today seems to be economic. So what is the future of Quad? That is what I'm saying, and that is why I said political cooperation is also there, right? And economic cooperation is also there. And I said, while it may seem you have shifted away from politics to economics, but that economic cooperation is being driven by a political agenda. ये चीज याद रखिए. And closer political cooperation is there. And while Quad is not a military grouping, India has simultaneously been doing joint military operations with US, Australia and Japan. है ना? तो एक ambiguity India has deliberately maintained. देखिए कई बार बोलते हैं कि हम क्लियरली बता नहीं रहे हम क्या चाहते हैं. अरे भाई क्यों बताएं? In the world of international politics, offering certainty to your opponent is not a virtue. Maintaining ambiguity is a virtue. Often it is argued because you leave the scope open for negotiations. By maintaining this ambiguity, what is India signaling to China? That look, अभी बात हो सकती है, बात सुलझ सकती है, हम अलायंस में नहीं है उनके साथ, but we can work closely with them if you don't change your ways. Wang Yi came, Jaishankar ने बोला देखो we can't have any normalization of relationship. Please don't expect कि 2 साल उड़ गए तो हम पीछे हट जाएंगे. That it's been 2 years since Galwan. So now there can be any normalization of ties. India said unless peace and tranquility is restored on the border, there cannot be any normalization of time or business as usual. ठीक है, तो ऐसा नहीं है. There is a certain degree of ambiguity being maintained by India, partly to meet its own foreign policy objectives. Yes. Given the consent related concerns regarding because this is data driven policy. दुनिया में कुछ नहीं है डेटा ड्रिवन. आप बोले सर कैसी बात कर रहे हैं, डेटा एज चल रहा है, डेटा इज द न्यू ऑयल है. Please understand that Blue Dot Network, what you're asking is, sir, इसमें तो all the decisions are going to be made primarily on the basis of feasibility and data. While it is true that viability of the projects will be assessed based on crucial data, and so it will be data driven, but at the same point of time, I am again and again saying, economic decisions also have a political angle to it. Clearly, through the Blue Dot Network, they are trying to say that we will not fund unviable projects. वो नहीं करेंगे हम. But they will tell to the whole world चीख चीख के कि ये project unviable है. मान लीजिए, बस मानने को मान लीजिए, ऐसा है नहीं. Suppose India is building a rail line called the Bullet train connecting Ahmedabad to Mumbai. Government of India says, वाह वाह क्या project है. Japan says, वाह वाह क्या project है. Say China says, we have done an independent study of India Japan bullet train project. It's an unviable project. फिर it will raise questions in India's own domestic politics also and outside in the world also, that are these two governments fooling their own people? And in a mature democracy, opposition will ask questions. Government will say, we have done study. They'll ask, show us the study. Parliament में matter discuss होगा. ये पूछा जाएगा कि is the best use of resources or not. ये सब हो ही रहा होगा इंडियन पार्लियामेंट में. विकास हो रहा है, वो जरूरी है, विकास को रोकना गलत बात है. If independent India is building its first important rail link and you have a problem with it, I have a problem with you. Right? So basically saying what? The Blue Dot Network is going to expose partly, if implement, पहली बात ये सब आइडिया है ना, प्लीज डोंट टेक देम टू सीरियसली कि ये हो ही रहा है. एशिया अफ्रीका ग्रोथ कॉरिडोर की बात पिछले 7 साल से हो रही है, ठीक है, उसमें मोर सो फ्रॉम द पास्ट 4-5 ईयर कुछ नहीं हो रहा उसमें. हाँ, बट द एशिया अफ्रीका ग्रोथ कॉरिडोर हैज नॉट रियली मटेरियलाइज्ड as of now, and the Blue Dot Network, if was to be implemented properly, would be a vast repository of knowledge talking about the feasibility of projects and also exposing which are unviable projects, and also cautioning governments that they should not get into a potential debt trap vis-a-vis China. But if any country's government has decided to get into debt trap, then what can a US do or a India do? If the Rajpakshas have decided, so be it. It is then between the Sri Lankan people and the Rajpakshas to decide. Right? So that's the context of the Blue Dot Network, etc. Ji. Why USA is not selling its sharing military technology? Why USA is not sharing military technology with India? You talk to madam about this. Simply put, USA is willing to sell arms to India. If you give up technology, then Indians can manufacture it on its own. USA is that way killing its own market. But please understand, no major military power will share technology with you. They are sharing with, so his question is also valid कि sir अभी आप बोल रहे कि they will not share technology with you, then how come they are sharing it with UK and Australia? There are examples of countries in the world with whom they will share technologies, but with whom? Who are strong alliance partners, who have a declared open-ended alliance with them. Is India an alliance partner? No. If you look, कई लोग बोलते हैं कि ब्रह्मोस जो है वो इंडिया और रशिया का एक जॉइंट मिलिट्री वेंचर है, and that's an example of Russians transferring much of that technology to India. the devil is a bit in the detail in the sense that while we are jointly developing the BrahMos missile platforms, which is whatever cruise missile, ye missile, wo missile, many of their critical components are actually brought from Russia while they are assembled in India. Even Russia has not been very willing. No country, for that matter, wants to give up its prized technology to any other country, because in that way you are giving up your leverage vis-a-vis your defense partner. Okay, तो ऐसा कोई नहीं है जो टेक्नोलॉजी ही ट्रांसफर कर दे. Yes, what can happen is that US companies under Make in India may come and start manufacturing defense weapons in India in collaboration with a joint venture with an Indian company. Like Larsen and Turbo, like Tata's, like एक और कंपनी हुआ करती थी अनिल धीरू भाई अंबानी ग्रुप. ये वो महान कंपनी है जो क्या बनाएगी भारत में? रफेल. जो कंपनी ने आज तक जीवन में एक भी गोली भी नहीं बनाई. will manufacture one of the world's most advanced military aircraft in India in collaboration with the French company Rafale. It is another matter that Anil Dhirubhai's company has gone bankrupt, but still बनाएंगे तो वही है ना. DRDO तो गई घास चरने, उनके बस की नहीं है. DRDO has no experience, no expertise, no skilled professional. Anil Dhirubhai Ambani has all of it, because once kid God and then their incarnations. So that's another story. But that's military cooperation is another story of its own. So that is about this, which largely completes your topic on East Asia. थोड़ा बहुत जापान और इसका वो मैं हैंडआउट में दे दूंगा, आप उसमें से पढ़ लीजिएगा अगर कुछ होगा तो थोड़ा बहुत. So East Asia is complete. Largely South Asia is complete, which leaves partly West Asia जो मुझे कवर करना है. Russia, China and US मैम will cover. Okay. और फिर जो छोटी मोटी चीजें होंगी वो बाद में भी हो जाएंगी, बट द मेजर चंक इसके बाद जो है वो इज, हाँ बाकी चीजें हो जाएंगी, बट जो मेजर चंक है वो है रशिया, चाइना, यूएस. दैट फर्स्ट मैम विल कवर. उसके बाद विल सी ऑन अदर थिंग्स. वेयर आर द ऑफ the Quad doesn't have a secretariat or anything as of now, so doesn't have a headquarter anywhere.